According to Constantino, Aguinaldo represented the opposition to Spain. He cannot be the symbol of our struggle against America because he himself blunted our people's struggle against the new conqueror. He and his Ilustrado advisors inaugurated an era of subservience and laid down a tradition of mendicancy. And of course, this view was appears in another form, in a more ideological form in Philippine society and revolution. So a whole generation or two of Filipino youth who read PSR and Constantino's Philippines a Past Revisited, and that includes me, were kind of, I wouldn't say indoctrinated, but we were influenced by these writings to take a negative view of Aguinaldo. Amado Guerrero or Jose Maria Sison states, I won't read the whole thing, but as US imperialism forced the Aguinaldo government to retreat, it played on the weaknesses in the ranks of the Ilustrado leadership of the revolution. Aguinaldo failed to lead the revolution effectively. Aguinaldo turned against such anti-imperialists as Mabini and Luna and increasingly relied on such capitulationists as Paterno and Buencamino. I think the film Heneral Luna captures this left view of Aguinaldo's role. These two traitors, who in the previous years were notorious for their puppetry to Spanish colonialism, had sneaked into the revolutionary government and usurped authority therein. Now I add on the right side of my PowerPoint slide this point that Amado Guerrero makes, which I think is an important one, which I would try to contest. In every town, he said, occupied by the US imperialist troops, puppet municipal elections were held and dominated by the old Principalia. These puppet elections excluded the masses who could not comply with the property and literacy requirements. These sham elections were used mainly to break off the Principalia from the revolution and to attract its members into becoming running dogs in the same way that the Spanish colonialists had done. This, I think, is based on a rather simplistic and maybe even erroneous view of municipal politics, and especially of the results of the so-called puppet municipal elections held in 1900 and 1901. Because in my book, published 2 years ago, I show that at least in Southern Tagalog, many of these mayors and cabezas or mayors who were elected under American auspices practice amigo warfare. On the surface, during daytime, they were friendly to the Americans, they seemed to be loyal, but at night they were supporting Malvar. So we should not take these things at face value. I think that the problem with this view is that it doesn't try to understand the workings of municipal politics and the role of mayors, which is very important. Now, as a reply to the left, Marcos, or should I say Adrian Cristobal, because people say that he was actually the ideologue behind Marcos, just as Mabini was the ideologue behind Aguinaldo. All these presidents have some ideologues lurking around behind them. You know? I wonder who is the ideologue lurking behind our present mayor president. But anyway, in today's Revolution Democracy, Democracy, published in 1971, Marcos disputes the minority that hopes for violent change and that regards as genuine only those revolutions which come from below, which means the masses taking direct action against their government. Instead, he says the so-called rule of the intellectual oligarchy was an essential element in the revolutionary and political tradition. It was the revolutionary vanguard. The demands of the 1896 revolution were in fact articulated, says Marcos or Cristobal, by the Ilustrado propagandists who desired, quote, a political authority that would be the instrument of national liberation. Marcos rides on the back of Aguinaldo's advisor Mabini, who wrote of the need for social regeneration, a purging of bad blood, an internal as well as external revolution. The instrument for this revolution would be the political authority, quote unquote. So basically what Marcos is trying to construct here is the idea that Aguinaldo's revolutionary government in 1898 is the precursor, the model for Marcos's democratic revolution or martial law. Now back to the PHA. On November 28, 1972, Marcos delivered a speech at the annual convention of the PHA, which actually was held at the Maharlika Hall of Malacanang. Has the PHA had any other meeting at Malacanang since then? Maybe, huh? Nakadalawa. Oh, okay. Well, this was a historic one, I think, because Marcos also gave a talk which apparently was not prepared, but it was taped, so it was transcribed, if I'm not mistaken. And first he says to the historians of the PHA, I am glad that you have gone into all these exercises in putting into print the memoirs of the revolution of Aguinaldo and his colleagues. I am very happy indeed that you are documenting everything, and it is my hope that you will also document these events that are occurring now. For you show to us the strengths, the weaknesses, the deficiencies, not only of our people, but of individual leaders. And by publishing them from time to time, you remind us that there is no man who can claim infallibility. And then in this speech, which I find very remarkable because it shows that he's talking to historians, by the way. This is the PHA National Convention. And what he was trying to do was to link himself to Aguinaldo. For example, and this is just one of the several occasions in that speech where he talks about Aguinaldo and himself, he says, when I was reading the account of Aguinaldo's experience on the famous trek from the Sierra Madre in the Cordilleras towards Palanan, I was taken aback at the parallelism between the experience of Aguinaldo and his grandsons of the 1940s. Who are his grandsons of the 1940s? The guerrillas, Marcos himself. So he's drawing parallels between Aguinaldo in 1901 and the guerrilla leaders fighting the Japanese in the 1940s. In Aguinaldo in 1898, 1899 up to 1900, of course, quarreling with another great patriot, General Antonio Luna, who insisted that after the Battle of Caloocan, they break up into guerrilla bands and not limit themselves to conventional warfare, the line system and holding ground. But Aguinaldo, realizing that he had to maintain the cohesion and the unity of his command in order that he could maintain the semblance of a republic and of a government, insisted upon conventional warfare, and thus they were destroyed in detail, as the military would put it. They were destroyed in successive battles until they were forced to the mountains. In short, Aguinaldo's experiences were recounted, and I read them. So Marcos was actually an avid reader of history. I know some people will say, that's just a myth, but from talking to people involved in the Tadhana project, this is true. He was one of the most historically minded, if not the most historically minded presidents that we have had. So finally, going back to the speech to the historians of the PHA in 1972, he said, when did we turn a corner in our historical march towards our objectives, our dreams, our ideals? There are many who will point to the fact that the establishment by the Filipinos of the first republic in Asia and in Africa was a historical fact. This is a reference to Aguinaldo, by the way, and we point that out. And then, in contemporary history, when was the turning point? There are many who have said that the turning point was my proclamation 1081. But why did it take me such a long time to take such a decisive step? And when I proclaimed martial law, and the people noticed that it was a peaceful kind of revolution, everybody sighed with relief, including those who were engaged in violence, because now they could return to their old habits, and many volunteered to surrender firearms. So this is Marcos making a parallel between the formation of the First Republic by Aguinaldo and Marcos's declaration of martial law and the formation of the new society. So this is one example of the uses of our heroes in order to legitimize present-day projects. In 1975, Ambassador Guerrero wrote a book called Today Began Yesterday, a historical approach to martial law. This book is not well known, but I think it's a very important book. It's not well known because people dismiss it as just an apologia for martial law. Well, now that martial law is history, just as the Japanese occupation is now history, we can supposedly go back to it and look at it from different perspectives. Instead of saying, Guerrero's book is just a defense of martial law, let's read it. And what does he say? Because he was not a stupid man. He was actually a great scholar as well as a diplomat. And his book on Rizal, the first Filipino, is a classic. Anyway, he says the first Philippine Republic was what we would now be termed a provisional revolutionary government headed by a dictator, Aguinaldo, the commander-in-chief of a people's army, manned and officered for the most part by unlettered peasants. The structure of Aguinaldo's government was a remarkable anticipation of the system of indirect elections that was to be in later times the framework of the guided democracies of much of Asia, but conspicuously different from the American form of government. Who can tell now what form of political system the Filipinos might have worked out by and for themselves if the First Republic had not been betrayed, as the Filipinos saw it, and destroyed by its ally against Spain, the United States, and what social structures. So what he's saying is that we don't know what Aguinaldo and the First Philippine Republic would have evolved to become. It would have evolved into a homegrown, very Filipinized, very localized form of government. But unfortunately, it was killed off in its early stages by the Americans, and so the Americans imposed their own system of government on the Philippines, and therefore we don't know what Aguinaldo's government would have become. And so in the experiment of the 70s with martial law, in a way, what Guerrero is saying, maybe this is closer to what Aguinaldo's government would have evolved into. Anyway, it is an interesting reflection of what might have happened if the Americans hadn't come and ruled us for 40 so years. The problem, as I am even facing now in studying history, is that our framework of understanding of history is still so much shaped by the discourses that were created in the American colonial period. We're still very Americanized in the way we view our own history, despite the fact that sometimes we can sound very radical and very innovative, but we may actually be falling back on the frameworks of knowledge established during the American occupation period. And so this is my, in a way, I'm nearing the end of my presentation. In my book, Passion and Revolution, published in 1979, when I was a young man, on President Emilio Aguinaldo fell the unenviable task of preserving the Filipino elite's conservative definition of the state, while as a commander-in-chief of the army, channeling the people's energies toward the war with the United States. Perhaps no other individual could have played that role. Aguinaldo was a veteran of the early national struggles. His successful military exploits, attributed no doubt by many to his powerful anting-anting, conferred an aura of power about him. In the eyes of many, he was no different from Apolinario de la Cruz or Hermano Pule, who liked to appear before his followers brandishing a luminous magical saber. Furthermore, Aguinaldo was an effective orator, familiar with the traditional idiom of struggle. Here you can see what I'm more interested in is how Aguinaldo appeared to the masses, why he was actually able to lead people into war. But at the same time, I was also influenced by Constantino and the critical writings of Aguinaldo, about Aguinaldo. And so I came to the conclusion that whatever Aguinaldo had to say in public had to reconcile the views and interests of all classes of society, no matter how grave the inherent contradictions were. For example, in his speech to the Principales, which I analyze in my book, he defines nationalism as a union of views and aspirations centered on independence or freedom from foreign domination, because the Ilustrados reserved for themselves the right to define Filipino aspirations and had in fact defined independence as political autonomy or self-government by Filipinos. Radical interpretations of independence from elements of the so-called poor and ignorant class, to paraphrase the Ilustrados, were branded as anti-revolutionary by the leaders of the Republic. Actually, in Passion Revolution, I am very much influenced by Agoncillo's writings about Bonifacio. It's a pro-Bonifacio book, and therefore, Passion Revolution would not be entirely sympathetic to Aguinaldo. But that was how many years ago? 1979, ilan taon na ba? May 14 na ba? 14 na? Oh my God. Okay, so I was 40 years younger. What have I learned since then? I have learned to appreciate Aguinaldo more. And to, well, after all, I'm only 1 year younger than our president, Duterte. And so we all passed through the stage of being influenced by the radical movement, and I too had my experience with the radical movement in the late 60s and early 70s. But so much has happened since then, and so therefore, if we are honest with ourselves, we should also re-examine our previous views and change them if necessary. Unfortunately, I know too many people who never change. What they believed in 1970, they still believe in 2019. I feel sorry for them, actually. So now, my final book to be examined here is Alfredo Saulo's Emilio Aguinaldo, Generalissimo and President. It's a long title. I read this book, and it was, to me, the best book on Aguinaldo I read. I don't know if people agree with me, but I like this book, and he's not someone who writes as a young man. Saulo was a journalist, and he was a member of the Hook Rebellion. He participated in the Hook Rebellion. He wrote a book about communism. And this book on Aguinaldo is a book written by someone with a lot of experience behind him. And he identified the problem in the way that we view Aguinaldo. And I'd like to just read the problem of American black propaganda against Aguinaldo. It underlined American policy vis-a-vis Aguinaldo throughout the 48 years of American occupation. Of course, the Americans could not be faulted for downgrading Aguinaldo, says Saulo, keeping him out of contention for national hero, being the symbol of Filipino resistance to American colonization. Thus, Aguinaldo never had a good press during the American period. His premier role in the revolution against Spain and in the subsequent war against the United States has never been fully and truthfully discussed in history books, because Filipino historians, especially those educated in America, have glossed over those incidents which might put the Americans in a bad light, and conversely, give Aguinaldo a favorable image. Saulo draws attention to Aguinaldo's background as town mayor. Could it be the key to his success, to his leadership success? For example, and this is just one of the several examples that Saulo gives, when the Katipunan revolt under the leadership of Bonifacio met its Waterloo in San Juan del Monte, a place now known as Pinaglabanan, a Tagalog word meaning where the battle occurred, Aguinaldo, the soft-spoken, unassuming, and pious 27-year-old Capitan Municipal of Cavite El Viejo, quickly picked up the fallen torch and continued the fight, turning the failed uprising of the Manila proletariat into the victorious revolution of the countryside. A revolution with no high-sounding Marxist objective, but pure and simple national liberation. Now this is a very interesting statement because he talks about the Katipunan uprising in Manila as the uprising of the Manila proletariat. The problem with the way some people have viewed the masses is that they lump everything together. The proletariat, the rural masses, the municipal populations, they are all the masses. But in fact, it's very clear that Bonifacio's appeal was to a certain proletarian class. The Manila proletariat and seamen, it was the Filipinos working in the ships, for example, that spread the Katipunan ideas throughout the archipelago, but not peasant farmers so much. And so the peasant population, for example, in southern Tagalog, were still very much influenced by the leadership of the local mayors and cabezas. They're the key. So in 2017, let me just make a little advertisement for my recent book, which is still quite new. I'm sure people have not heard of it. But in the picture of, I don't know if you can see the picture of the photo of the cover. This is actually my father, and this is actually my father's classmate at West Point. His name is Eduardo Suatenco from Polo, Bulacan, who they were both together at West Point. Anyway, just a connection between the book cover and Polo, Bulacan. The house of the Suatencos is actually opposite the house of my grandfather. Note that Aguinaldo and Malvar, this is about my book. Note that Aguinaldo and Malvar, the two greatest generals, or among the greatest generals of the revolution, were town mayors before they became successful revolutionists. In mid-1898, when Aguinaldo returned from exile to resume the revolution, the mayors and cabezas of southern Tagalog brought their cuadrilleros, the local police, and armed groups to the Spanish strongholds of Lipa and Tayabas and laid siege to them until they surrendered. When U.S. forces invaded southern Tagalog in 1900, the mayors and cabezas were almost all involved in the defense of their towns. When the towns eventually became occupied and garrisoned by American troops, most of the mayors who were installed by the colonial government played a double game of cooperating with Americans during daytime while aiding the guerrilla forces of Malvar at night, which I discuss in my book as Amigo warfare. Town mayors were vilified because they had been deeply involved in the prolonged resistance against U.S. occupations. Since Aguinaldo had emerged from this municipal elite, his image became tarnished as well. Aguinaldo was depicted in American authored books and pamphlets as a paragon of the old cacique elite, the product of the collaboration between Indio mayor and Spanish friar, a living proof of the disease called caciquism, that had to be stamped out by English education and the formation of a new elite that would internalize American values. Aguinaldo's leadership of the newly formed republic was mocked as a travesty of democracy, as a violent strongman's vain attempt to gain legitimacy and recognition. Aguinaldo was even depicted as a murderer. The controversial killings of Bonifacio and Luna were attributed immediately to him without proof. Anything to suit the narrative of a violent, power-grabbing, and corrupt municipal elite was brought in to disparage Aguinaldo. The sarcastic dismissal of mayor presidents by Americans and urban illustrados goes way back in time. Thank you very much.